Hello. So recently I've stumbled across people are doing what they call reactive videos, which is basically they watch a video and they give their comments on it as they watch it. Um, Not going to comment on the. This itself seems weird, but not going to comment on it. I am going to comment. One thing I've seen a few people are watching about slavery, and one thing keeps coming up. How could people do this? How could how can people own other people and people as property? And you know it's wrong. How can slavery exist? And they go on and on and on. I'm not going to try to sugarcoat slavery here. I agree it's wrong, but I watch these videos and I realize slavery ended here in America about 160 years ago. 5 to 7 generations, depending on how you count a generation. So we get most people alive today grew up in a world where slavery is bad. And that's what was taught, and that's what was believed, and that is still believed. As opposed to people 160 years ago who grew up in a world where slavery had existed for thousands of years. Every culture, every civilization has had slavery. Much of it worse than it was here in the United States. Again, not going to try to sugarcoat things here, but at the same time, you got to admit, slavery, especially in Africa at the time, back 200, 300 years ago in Africa, slavery was worse there than here in the United States. Not going to go into that argument, but you have to admit it's true. Or you have to admit you're just making up facts. Because history, go back and read history, and it tells that it was bad. And of course, as I've said in a past video, a lot of this history was written by Europeans, and therefore it's considered not accurate, because clearly Europeans lie about everything. And again, history, as I said, it's by definition what's written down, and the African slave owners or the Asian slave owners or whoever, around the world we go, Native American slave owners, which existed, they weren't writing things down about slavery. We had the abolition movement, which was writing the bad parts of slavery as opposed to just, most history we have, as I said in a past video, was, tax documents or some laws regarding slavery or stuff like that, but they didn't go into details. With the abolitionist movement, we had people coming up saying, here's what slavery was like, and here's why it's bad. But of course, that was all Europeans talking about other Europeans, and so naturally, European slavery looks worse than other forms of slavery. But again, that's not what I'm looking at. I am here, this video, I'm going to talk about, our view of slavery, how it differed. What was it like after slavery was abolished and an ex-slave is walking down the street and comes across an ex-slave owner? What happened? And we don't have a lot of people writing about that because, it was just sort of something that was accepted. This slavery happened in the past. We aren't necessarily pointing the finger and saying, oh, you're evil, you're evil, you're evil. Or they weren't back then, at least. We're doing it now, of course. And there was, I don't know, forgiveness isn't maybe not the right word for it, but there was understanding that, yes, we grew up in a world where for thousands of years people believed slavery was a natural thing. And so they accepted it. Whereas, again, like I said, today we've grown up 160 years of slavery is bad, and so we don't understand. How could this have ever existed? Well, it did for thousands of years. We've got a warped sense that it was created 300, 400 years ago by white people, and then, they gave up on it. And so we've got our evil people, our bad guys, And we're ignoring the fact that no, this was created thousands of years ago by everyone, and it was accepted. You know, it wasn't. You didn't like being a slave. No one. Oh, yay, this is acceptable. I want to be a slave. No one did that. But the idea that someone just bought a slave down the street, yeah, because slavery existed. Again, not trying to justify slavery. I'm trying to explain the attitude towards it. Because again, like I said, I watch these videos and everyone's like, well, how could this have existed? Well, it existed because everyone did it and everyone accepted it. Even the abolitionists, when they wrote about slavery, it wasn't, oh, the slave owners are evil people. It was slavery is an evil institution, and these people are just doing one more sin than everyone else is doing. Because the abolitionists acknowledged that they were sinners. And this was just another sin that someone else was doing. So, how can, the abolitionists didn't accept slavery, but they did accept the existence of slave owners as just another form of sinner. So, and that was one thing. So again, we have generations of people who grew up without slavery, and that's why slavery of the past, we look at slavery of the past and we don't believe it. How could this have ever happened? And it's, again, not trying to justify slavery, but the reason it was acceptable in the past was because it was acceptable for thousands upon thousands of years. And so people grew up with it. We grew up without it, and therefore we don't understand it. Now, along those lines, agriculture. Oh, slaves had such a horrible, horrible, horrible life. And again, not going to try to justify this or try to, justify, well, it was better here in America than it was in Africa, which some people say it was. Or, it was worse here in America than it was in Africa, which some people say it was. For the past, at least 3 generations, probably longer, agriculture in America is just sort of, it's still a major industry, it's just fewer people are involved in it. And, a lot of these people questioning, oh, how could this happen, have never worked on a farm or have no experience with agriculture or how the understanding of agriculture. And so we look at, the slaves worked 10 hours a day year round. No, they didn't. A crop, harvest time is maybe 2 weeks. And that's after about 3 weeks of waiting for stuff to grow. You plant stuff, it takes maybe a week to plant stuff. You wait a couple of months, 2 or 3 months for it to grow, and then you harvest it. What are you doing in that 2 or 3 months that it's growing? And there is other work that needs to be done, but it's not the 10 hours harvesting or, 12, 15 hours. I've looked it up on the internet and I've seen, various sources saying up to slaves only got 4 hours sleep and they worked 18 hours, which they'd all be dead if they did that. You got to understand the slaves are expensive. And so the slave owner was in their best interest to keep their slaves as healthy as possible, which didn't mean the same as keeping their family and friends healthy, I'll admit. But at the same time, this whole idea of let's beat them every day and let's work them to death every day. And there was some motivation there to keep them healthy, to give them time to rest. And so, again, people, modern day people who work on farms, who actually do agriculture, to them slavery's not as big a deal. I mean, they know it's wrong, but the idea, well, yeah, we had people working farms. To them, it's natural. Even with mechanization versus, the pre-industrial slavery, they know how much work actually goes into running a farm. So they know, yes, there are going to be times when you have to work extra hard, but then there are other times when you don't have to work extra hard. And this notion that, we are taught in school about, they were working 12 hours a day 365 days a year was wrong. So that's another thing is we grew up in a world where we don't understand agriculture, therefore we don't understand what slavery was really like. Again, not trying to justify slavery, not trying to sugarcoat it, but at the same time, I don't know what's the opposite of sugarcoating. Sour coating? I'm not going to sour coat it either. And then a few videos came up with, a slave could not buy their freedom, or a black slave could not buy their freedom, a white slave could buy their freedom, and all sorts of, that was horrible, there's a big difference. Black slaves bought their freedom from time to time. But the video said, no. The video said in Virginia a black man couldn't buy his freedom. The different states had different laws. I mean, we talk about the northern free states versus the southern slave states, but then we turn around and we talk as if slave laws applied uniformly across the board. They didn't. Different states had their own laws. And again, for the past 4 or 5 generations, we have grown up in a world where the federal government has been taking more and more power from the states. And so it's as easy to understand how modern people look back and say, well, there was this law that said slaves couldn't do such and that applied all over. And no, it didn't apply all over. It applied to that state. But again, we have grown up in a world where it's acceptable for the federal government to just step in and do stuff when it shouldn't. And so, again, this, watching these people, watching these other videos, and saying, how could this have happened? Well, things were a lot different back then. And what you're thinking happened didn't happen uniformly like you thought it did. It happened state by state, different laws. And some states had better laws. Slaves were treated better in some states than in others because they had different laws. Now, as an amateur writer, we have the dystopian future. You read movies about this, what's happening in the dystopian future, and big corporations are going to take over, and we're basically going to be slave states. And I got to thinking about this as an amateur writer, because they always start these movies after, this is like 20 years after the corporations took over. They never tell how this came about, or they give a very vague general description. Back in the Great War between the corporations, people fell into debt and the corporations took over, and that's it. And they don't go into any detail on this. And as an amateur writer, I sort of just wondered, how would this actually come about? How would we actually move back into slavery? Is it possible? And not just slavery, but to where people would actually openly admit slavery. Because, again, all these movies, all these books, dystopian future, they don't call it slavery. They don't openly. So, could we move back into slavery where people would openly start referring to it as slavery? And, of course, to do that, one, we would need laws which made slavery legal. Otherwise, no one would call it slavery. I mean, that's one of the reasons we talk about human trafficking so much. Is we don't want to call it slavery because we don't want to believe slavery exists. And again, people watching these videos, slavery was bad, how could it exists today? We just call it by different names. And it's not as widespread and it's not illegal, but it does exist. And so, for people to openly talk about slavery in the future, it would take laws. So the government would have to be behind it. And back to what I was saying about, we've had 3 or 4 generations growing up where the government's taking more power from the states. The federal government's taking more power from the states. That means we have 3 or 4 generations who will be more accepting when slavery actually is reintroduced, if it ever is. Do you ever think about that? And you say, oh, I would never accept slavery. We already are in some cases. We just aren't calling it slavery yet. Now, this sounds like conspiracy theory, I know. But again, if you look at how we moved away from slavery, where, yes, it was made illegal, and we didn't just turn around and blame the slave owners because we understood that's what they always went, this was thousands of years and we understood it. If you look at that, and then you look at how we are giving up our rights in order for, freedom to be given to us, our supposed freedom to be given to us. And yeah, it's very believable that we could go back into a slave state and the word slave will be used freely without any question. So that's it. Like I said, I just wanted to talk about that, because I saw these videos and everyone's like, how could this possibly happen? They act like, again, our understanding of slavery, our history of slavery has been rewritten so many times by people trying to act like, oh, back, 400 years ago, Europeans threw a switch, freedom. Europeans threw a switch, slavery. And then, 160 years ago, we threw another switch. We threw the switch the other way, and slavery was no longer allowed. That's not the history of the world. And so, for everyone who watches reactionary videos and says, how could this have happened? How could this have happened? How it got started, we don't know, because that was thousands of years ago. How could it be acceptable? It was acceptable because for thousands of years it had been done. And so the people 200 years ago, again, not justifying slavery, but I do understand how they could find it acceptable. Because they had thousands of years of everyone finding it acceptable. Just as we today have 160 years of people finding it wrong, and so we don't understand it. So that's it. That's all I wanted to say. Have a nice day.